The Bond, the Christian podcast for purposeful and peaceful parenting. We want to understand children's hearts, reach parents' hearts, and see God with new eyes. 5 young Christian moms started this podcast in September 2020 in Germany. My name is Liz. I'm a social worker and I currently work as a daycare mom. I'm also the mom of 2 little boys. Keishawn is 6 years old and Jaden is 2. We wish you God's blessing as you listen to our episode about what babies really need. Today, we will be specifically talk about the first year of life. At this age, babies bond via the first level of attachment, which is that of closeness to their caregiver. So if you haven't listened to the episode on the first attachment level yet, I highly recommend listening to it before you continue to listen to this one. We now want to talk about 2 topics that are most probably the 2 most important topics for parents in the first year of their newborn's life: sleeping and eating. After all, babies do almost nothing else. Today, we'll talk about sleep training programs and why we generally think that babies should sleep through the night in their own room as quickly as possible. And after that, we'll take a quick look at the topic of food. What about breastfeeding or feeding by time? When do I feed the first puree? And how do I know if my baby has eaten enough of it? Finally, we'll look at why what we will hear today is so important for our relationship with God and with our children. A child has only one way to bond during the first year of life: closeness. That's why babies are carried so much. They are born premature. They cannot walk right after birth, contrary to horse foals, for example. And they are fed by lying in their mother's or other close caregivers' arms. As parents, we know how stressful this first year is, not only emotionally, but especially physically. The sleepless nights, the days spent practically just feeding, changing diapers, and sleeping. As a result, the most common question parents probably get asked during the first year of life is the baby sleeping through the night yet? If answered in the negative, this question is often followed by 1 or more pieces of good advice on how to make this happen as quickly as possible. You have to introduce a ritual. That's so important. Did you darken the room? I always put her in the cradle and said, "Shh." Then she fell asleep, and when she woke up, I said that again, and then she went back to sleep. You just have to let the boy cry sometimes. Then he will realize that you don't always jump when he cries, and eventually he will fall asleep at some point. Especially for parents who have to deal with a bad sleeper, a child that, contrary to the apparent norm, does not sleep well after a certain time. These phrases unfortunately often cause uncertainty and anxiety in addition to being annoyed. What am I doing wrong? Why doesn't it work for us? Are we already too lenient? This child is still so small, but shouldn't we be showing who are queen and king in the castle? Maybe he is already spoiled because he's almost only in the baby carrier during the day. But outside of the carrier, he immediately starts to cry again. When you ask other parents, how did you do it? You often get answers ranging from, nothing. After a while, he just slept through the night. To, I did some sleep training with her. It was a bit hard with the crying, but it worked great. This kind of sleep training goes back to the so-called Verbe method, also known as CIO, cried out method. And there are also some variations of it. What they all have in common is that you train your child to sleep without you by putting them down in the bed awake and let them cry it out. Cry until they fall asleep. The aim is to teach them how to soothe themselves independently from you, not needing your comfort. Now, due to my studies of early childhood education, I already had a strong opinion towards sleep training before I even had kids. But a very practical experience was the one that stuck with me. I was pregnant with my first son when a lady from my church told me that she had done sleep training with all her kids and how great this method works and how effective it will give you peaceful nights. At the time, she was pregnant with her fourth child. After her daughter was born, we were once at their house for a meeting where we experienced what sleep training looks like. Throughout the entire evening, we heard the little girl, who was only a few months old, cry at the top of her lungs through the baby phone, which was with us in the room. It was such an uncomfortable atmosphere. The mom explained to us, "Oh yes, it's hard to listen to this crying, but I've been through this process a few times already. It's only like this for the first couple of days until she has learned how to sleep alone. Then she will sleep just fine. It's okay. The only problem that we have at the moment is that her older brother and sister are going in sometimes to soothe her, and that disturbs the progress." I remember how I went home that night in shock and heartbroken, and that I swore to myself I would never leave my child alone crying like this. I'm not saying this to put this mom in a bad spotlight, because this mama didn't know better. She obviously thought she was using a great effective method for peaceful nights and was doing something good for her and her children. After my son was born, I also remember how I was very often frustrated because during the day, when he fell asleep, I wanted to put him down and showing some free hands and arms, and every time I did, just after a couple of minutes, he woke up crying because I was gone. And because I didn't want to let him cry for a long time, I therefore picked him back up and helped him back to sleep in the usual way, with breastfeeding, caring, and cuddling. I also learned that the baby carrier was my best friend. My youngest son, I didn't even use a stroller until he was able to sit in the buggy, but carried him all the time. When my sons woke up at night, I helped him go back to sleep in the same way. And I know that it can be very tiring sometimes. But thanks to brain and hormonal research, today we know very well what happens in the brain of a child when being left crying. When the child cries, the body is put in a state of stress. It secretes more cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, which helps us when we are stressed because it provides energy to the body in a short time. However, what most of us already know is that stress that you are exposed to over a longer period of time makes you sick. Why? Well, everyone probably knows that cortisone supplied from the outside as a drug not only has great anti-inflammatory effects, but also negative ones. It is the same with the stress hormone cortisol, which the body produces itself. It has negative effects on the central and autonomic nervous systems, as well as metabolic and immunological effects. Reduction in learning ability, obesity, lack of sleep, anxiety disorders, and depression are just some of them. Thus, potentiation of anxiety can occur in the central nervous system. Also, the reaction to stress later in life is different from that of normal people, and a kind of basic tension and very easy excitability develops. Growth can be affected by too much stress hormones, as can the ability to learn. The immune system also suffers, and children with a lot of stress are sick more often. Of course, no one wants that for their child. Nevertheless, the method of letting children cry it out, cry themselves to sleep, is still widespread. Why? Firstly, because too little is known about what happens in the child's body when they experience it. And secondly, because it works. Eventually, children fall asleep, and after only a few nights, often one is enough, they reliably sleep through the night. So, why does it work? Babies who demand bonding through closeness, and babies do this practically all the time, will try to draw attention to themselves by the means at their disposal. Maybe a little whining at first, but eventually they will cry and scream. If they cry without anyone reacting to their crying, they will first intensify their efforts. They will cry even louder and more intensively. At some point, and this can take a long time, for some babies, several hours, with the crying subsiding in the meantime, but never completely ceasing. They have cried themselves into such a frenzy that a protective mechanism in the body takes effect. The baby has been experiencing feelings of mortal fear and panic for quite some time now. They do not know that everything is okay, that the parents are in the next room, and that they are in a safe environment. Babies don't have an understanding of what we call object and people permanence, meaning they don't understand that objects and people still exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or otherwise sensed. So when you leave your baby's side, for them you are gone, and they cannot grasp that you still exist outside their sight in the next room. That only starts to develop at about 8 months. After all, they are still too small to get up and look for their parents. They only feel the fear of being abandoned and cannot understand why their crying does not change their terrible situation. Therefore, at some point, the body pulls the ripcord. It practically shuts down. The systems shut down. The body falls asleep from exhaustion. The brain stores this experience and, at the latest after a few such experiences, reliably reacts by falling asleep in the evening and staying asleep through the night. If parents have used this type of sleep training, early childhood trauma can occur, the further effects of which can range from sleep problems, learning problems, to anxiety disorders, depression, and addiction. We say it can, because this also depends on how the bond with the child is formed outside of the sleep situation. Here's a quick interjection, because many of the sleep trainings work with a toned down form. That is, they recommend going into the room at intervals precisely dictated by the clock, and briefly talking to the baby in a soothing way. Then, leaving the room again for a few minutes until the clock allows another round of soothing talk. However, once the babies have cried themselves into a frenzy, mere words, even from the mother, usually don't get through. The stress level is so high that the brain shuts down. Voices are no longer perceived. Then, the only thing that helps is touch, which activates the vagus nerve, a widely ramified nervous system that carries feelings from the brain to the body and conversely send signals from the body back to the brain. Calm, tender touches, cradling, and breastfeeding. The latter will only be possible once the baby has calmed down a bit. Signal the brain to give up its state of alarm. The so-called cuddle hormone oxytocin is released and the body shuts down its alarm system again. Wow! So we see how important closeness is for our baby. God has arranged it that the baby longs for our closeness and needs it to grow up healthy. Yes, very often this is exhausting, especially when the baby needs not only closeness to sleep, but also movement or our singing voice. And once it has successfully fallen asleep, it wakes up again several times during the night, and you often have to start the whole program all over again. And it is not enough just to nurse briefly or give the bottle. Every child is different. Yes, there are the model babies who wake up only once at night at 6 weeks and sleep through the night at 3 months. But the reality for the vast majority of parents is different if they do not use sleep training. A baby goes through a sleep cycle faster than an adult and wakes up afterwards. Some then find their way back to sleep on their own. Most of them do not. The book Nighttime Parenting: How to Get Your Baby and Child to Sleep by William Sears contains a lot of helpful information if you want to better understand baby sleep and everything related to it. Before the baby can sleep through the night, their brain has to mature, and this happens differently and at different rates for every baby. And there is not much you can do about it. We certainly do know now after the first 6 episodes that maturation happens not by trying to force the child into it. So can I teach the baby to sleep? No. They already can sleep. They just don't do it the way we want them to. But where does the idea come from that babies have to sleep alone in their own room by the time they are 6 months old, and often even earlier? Our Western world changed greatly at the beginning of the 19th century due to industrialization. Many children had to start working at a very young age to help support their families. At the end of the 19th century, the change was complete. The image of the child then was that of a small adult who had to be properly shaped. While before, and at the beginning of the age of industrialization, it was still normal for the entire family to live and sleep in a single room, this changed with increasing wealth in certain social classes and new technical inventions. Even before the beginning of the Second World War, one can clearly see how the image of children and their upbringing had already developed into a certain direction. U.S. American John Watson was a luminary in the field of education in the 1920s. He advised parents, never hug or kiss your children, never let them sit on your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when you say goodnight. Shake their hand in the morning. The popular infant care magazine advised its readers in 1929, don't hold your baby and rock him to make him stop crying, and don't nurse him until it is exactly time to do so. It will not harm the baby, even the very small infant, to cry. In Germany, Johanna Hara's book, The German Mother and Her First Child, became the Nazi parenting classic par excellence. It was published in 1934 and reprinted well into the post-war period. The statements in it follow on seamlessly from the ones just quoted. This imprint or option about how to raise a child is thus deeply anchored in us over many generations, as we have just seen. In all Western industrialized nations, whether they were fascists or socialists, this view on children was the usual one. It was only later that people slowly came to the realization that such views and methods must be rejected, and that the basic emotional needs of a human being must be recognized. The basis for this were, among others, the experiments of Harlow, which even back in 1957 seemed cruel. He separated young rhesus monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth and put them in a cage. There they could choose between two mock monkey mothers, one made of metal, which had a milk dispensing device, and another one covered with soft, cuddly fabric, but which could not give milk. The monkeys snuggled up to the milkless cloth mother with all their might. If God has already created such a behavior in the animal kingdom, how should it be any different in humans? Babies need closeness, cuddling, love. This applies to the first year of life and beyond. Even though babies learn a lot in the first year of life and their brains develop rapidly, they can only do so in a healthy way if they can rest securely in their parents' love. And they experience this love through bonding, which in the beginning can only be expressed through closeness. Later, about one more type of attachment is added per year of life. But this does not mean that the first stage becomes obsolete or unimportant. It is still very important, for some children more than others, depending on their nature. Sleep training is potentially harmful. Parents, you must trust your feeling that it is not normal and good to let your children cry. You must not forcefully suppress the urge to run to your children and pick them up, thinking you are doing a good deed for yourself and especially for the child. There are reports of women who have had their husbands lock them up so they could go through the sleep training. This is cruel for everyone, and the result is psychologically undesirable. Back to my own sleeping experience. When my son Keishan was 8 months old, we were moving, and somehow I thought this may be a good time to move him to his own room at night. The voices around me asking whether he sleeps in his own bed and room were getting louder. Today I've learned to frame myself from other people's opinion of what is best for me and my kids, but then I didn't know better, and I was also longing for some more rest and space during sleep. Well, that didn't happen as planned, because then I was going back and forward between our bedrooms and ended up with my son in my bed anyway, once I took him with because I was too tired to go back and forward. Our quality of sleep definitely went down. And even in his toddler years, he would still wake up every night, sometimes in panic, but always crying, and waiting until I came to fetch him. And to go to bed, it often took several hours for him to fall asleep. I somehow just got used to it. Only after my second son was born, it reached a point where I felt like something had to change. I now had a baby to my right and a toddler to my left, who no longer wanted to sleep in his room at all, since everyone was sleeping in the bedroom, and only he was supposed to sleep by himself, and I was squeezed and uncomfortable with horrible sleep in the middle between the both of them. At that time, I came across the concept of having a family bed and looked into it. This basically means nothing else than all family members sleeping in the same bed, and no one has to be alone at night. In our case, My husband built us a bed that is as big as a double and a single bed, plus the crib. And oh, how we loved it. For us, it was the perfect solution for all family members to get enough sleep. My baby didn't whine at all at night. I could stay lying in bed when he woke up, fed him while resting, and my toddler didn't need a long time anymore to go to sleep and slept throughout the night. And I had space again. What a relief. And for all of you that think they will never leave the nest, I can tell you this. Both of my sons have moved out of our bed into their own room together a couple of months ago. By the time Keishon was 5 and Jaden was 1.5. Now we had moved again, and Keishon wanted to move into his bedroom. And little Jaden, with 1.5, followed him, since he was not keen with going to bed apart from him. And so now they both sleep together in their own room. Jaden is lying on a mattress in front of Keishon's bed, so they co-sleep next to each other. That was honestly a bit hard in the beginning for me, since the bed felt kind of empty, although Jaden comes over to our bed for the second half of the night. And I can see a great difference in his confidence with the sleeping arrangements. When he wakes up at night, unlike his brother at his age, he just walks over to our room. I can see how him sleeping in a safe place and never alone has given him a great confidence out of which he can act now. This is what I've learned. The less pressure you put on your children when it comes to the sleeping situation. After all, we all know that you cannot force a child to sleep anyway. And the more you respond to a child's need and to the impulses that come from inside, the easier you will have it. And once they're ready to leave the nest, they will. For us, the perfect solution was to set up a family bed, and now for the two brothers to co-sleep next to each other in their own room. For others, the solution is for the kids to fall asleep in their own bed, but if they wake up at night, the parents will come and fetch them, and then they continue sleeping with them in their bed, which for us didn't really work with our older son, but it works fine with the little one, and he even walks to our room by himself. Still others have set up a sibling bed, where the siblings sleep in the same bed, and thus also sleep better and deeper. Again, others have set up a bed for the children in the same bedroom as the parents, next to the bed, if being uncomfortable with everyone sleeping in the same bed, and work well with that. At this point, it is important to make another brief remark about so-called high-need babies. There are babies who do not conform to the norm in any way, not even close. They seem to be much more demanding than average in everything. William Sears has elaborated on the main characteristics of these babies. As a parent, you feel as if these kind of babies drain all your energy. They never seem to be satisfied, constantly want to be nursed, wake up frequently, are difficult to soothe, can hardly be put down, and immediately react downright hysterically when separated from their mother, even for a short time. If you recognize your child in this, we recommend Sears' book. These children are not sick or abnormal, nor did you do anything to make your child be that way. A certain percentage of all babies are just like that. No one is to blame for this situation, yet it is a very stressful situation for parents, emotionally and physically. Be sure to seek support in this situation, such as friends or grandparents bringing over food, cleaning, doing laundry, taking the baby for a walk in the stroller, if possible, or get yourself a cleaner. High-need babies, by the way, often develop into highly sensitive children and adults. This, however, is another topic for another episode. As promised, we will now briefly discuss the topic of food during the first year of life. Did your pediatrician, the nurse at the hospital after the birth, your mother, grandmother, mother-in-law, or anyone else also tell you after birth that you should breastfeed your child according to a schedule? Like every 3 hours? No? Good. But maybe they did, because this view is also still common. This assumption also stems from the field of behavioral psychology and has been scientifically outdated for quite a long time now. There is evidence that babies fed on demand are more intelligent than their clock-fed peers. A baby has no sense of time, so when their stomachs make a noise, they will let you know. It is true that many children have an automatic rhythm, but there are always circumstances such as illness, a growth spurt, and other issues related to development when this rhythm gets out of step. A baby's stomach is tiny at first, and the contents are digested quickly, which is why mothers are usually breastfeeding or giving the bottle continuously during the first weeks. This settles down after a few weeks, but when the child grows, the body simply needs more and cannot wait until the clock says it's time. During one of the first checkups of my little son Jaden, he was not even 5 months old. The pediatrician handed me a brochure on the introduction of complementary foods with the logo of a well-known baby food manufacturer on it. She then told me that I have to start feeding my baby complementary food and reduce breastfeeding because it would not be enough for him anymore and would not provide all the necessary nutritions. My son was a healthy baby. I looked at her and said, "And how do you know this? Can you see inside my breast?" It is nice for people who own companies that make baby food because they of course make more money the earlier a baby eats porridge. But the official recommendations of the World Health Organization, however, are different. They recommend exclusive breastfeeding until the end of the 6th month of life, and then breastfeeding alongside complementary feeding until the 2nd birthday. After that, as mother and child wish. As always in life, it is important to avoid extremes. If the child shows an interest in food by 5 months of life and fulfills the necessary signs for complementary feeding, there is nothing to be said against giving them a piece of steamed vegetables in their hand so they can get to know their future food. The principle, food under one is just for fun, applies here. Breastfeeding or bottle feeding is the main source of nutrition throughout the first year of life though. All nutritions are available in the best possible composition here. Nothing else is needed by the child. It is not a bad thing if the child shows an interest in food early on, nor if he or she doesn't want to know about adult food for a long time. Carla and Rodrigo experienced both extremes, if you will. Their son didn't want to know about food until he was 13 months old. No matter what they tried, he had absolutely no interest in anything else besides breast milk. Their daughter, on the other hand, was looking at their mouths and licking her lips from an early age on. However, both children had one thing in common. They hated porridge. Whether homemade or store-bought, no chance. Rodrigo then came across the concept of baby-led weaning, or BLW for short, which aims to offer the baby solid food from the start of complementary feeding. There are a few things to keep in mind. For example, solid means steamed for now in most cases, and you should avoid salt altogether in the first year of life. But aside from that, most children enjoy being able to take their food into their own hands and explore it. And yes, sometimes it can be a bit messy. I know that because I've introduced food to my sons by the concept of baby-led weaning. But to see the smiles on their faces when they grasp the concept of food is priceless. A few final words about food. Just as you can't breastfeed your baby too much at the beginning, You shouldn't try to force a certain amount of porridge or other food into the baby later. Even the fattest nursing baby, nursed as needed, will simply lose its Michelin man-like appearance over time as they continue to grow in length. The same is true, by the way, for little heavy champions who are bottle-fed. And even later, children will get what they need. Unfortunately, there are labels that want to dictate parents how many grams of porridge the child should eat per meal, with a sad result, as you can see in a supposedly funny video on YouTube. In the video, you can see a mother who has a smartphone attached to her forehead with the help of a hairband. The baby sitting on the bed in front of her can watch the cartoon playing on it. She's holding a glass of porridge in her left hand and a spoon in her right. The baby stares at the little screen. The mother wiggles around a bit, making funny noises, putting on a show that allows her to shove spoonful after spoonful into the baby's mouth and make the jar empty after all. How to Get the Baby to Eat, or something like that is the title. The video is sad because, apart from the fact that the sequence of images in a cartoon overwhelms such a small child beyond measure, but that will be another topic, it can contribute to the child developing an eating disorder. Kids are born with a natural intuition of their hunger, so don't feed them if they don't show interest in food anymore, because the child gets used to not listening to the feeling of being full because it's constantly ignored. And then later on in life, it will have problems to stop eating when it's actually full. I myself was that child, and I've always struggled with my weight. And until today, it is hard for me to leave something on the plate, even though I'm full, and I still hear the voices telling me to eat up, or other kids don't have food, so continue eating and appreciate what you have in your plate, or you're such a good girl, you finished your whole plate. I know that you can lose this intuition for your hunger, and it's definitely something that I don't want my kids to experience. We can trust our children to eat what they need, and you will be surprised that they will go and finish later if you give them an option to keep it somewhere for the next hunger to come. You won't have to throw it away. Carlos Gonzalez has written the book, My Child Won't Eat, How to Enjoy Mealtime Without Worry, which deals in detail with all the myths and fears surrounding children and their eating behavior. We recommend this book to insecure parents. The conclusion for today. You can never spoil a child with closeness and the fulfilling of their basic needs during the first year of life. On the contrary, you create the conditions to satisfy the hunger for attachment. The child can come to rest and develop their potential and grow. That's exactly how God has created it. That's exactly how He wanted it to be. In the end, we also experience God's love only when we come close to Him. When we come close to Him, engage with Him, let Him encourage, comfort, and embrace us. And God wants to have this closeness to us all the time, not only when we consciously take time for devotion and prayer. That's why He sent us the Comforter, as He says in the Bible. It's the Holy Spirit who wants us to feel the loving and strengthening presence of God in every second of our lives. We've already explained this in our episode on the first stage of attachment. We as parents present God's character to our children during the first years of their life. Since children, when they are still very small, cannot yet grasp the concept of God or can grasp it only in fragments, we as parents are God to them. Their image of God is formed in the first 7 years by how we treat them. Later, they automatically transfer this to God. The way you have been raised is how you see God, as a loving, caring father, or as a strict judge. Of course, your image of God can change as an adult, even if it was shaped incorrectly in childhood. but this is usually a long and painful process that takes a lot of time, reflection, and tears. The more positive the image of parents in early childhood, the more positive and loving our image of God. Now please don't be afraid of making mistakes. This is inevitable, and we cannot be perfect in everything we do to avoid giving our child a false image of God. The important thing is the basic tendency. Be gracious with yourself and your faults. God is also gracious, and He wants to help you. This is true even if you now think, it's all too late, my children are teenagers now, and I did sleep training with them as infants. There's nothing more I can do. That's not true. On the other hand, as already mentioned, it depends on how the development of attachment between you and them was generally at that age. And for another, you can always work on bonding with the child, no matter what age. You can catch up on the attachment stages, even if it involves more effort for the parents. In our episode on the 6th attachment level, we talk about these attachment gaps. If you have enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with others. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Bond Podcast, and also follow us on Instagram under the same name. We also appreciate any feedback via the email address thebond@mail.de. God bless.